and welcome back to our latest Fraser-Valander podcast. I'm Hannah Randolph, an economist here at the Institute, and today I'm joined by Dr. Rebecca Kay of Migration Policy Scotland to talk about immigration in Scotland. So immigration was a bit of a hot topic during the general election last month, and it's likely to come up again during the Scottish parliamentary election in 2026. It's a bit of a tricky one though, because immigration policy is reserved, so Scottish government don't directly control the immigration policies, even when they do impact on Scotland. So some of you may recall in the news over the past year or so, talk of the UK's net immigration figures being historically high. Based on new statistics from National Records for Scotland last week, that's also true in Scotland. Net immigration from abroad more than doubled in the year to June 2022, when it was about 36,000, and the year before that it was about 13,000. There's a lot of reasons for that, but it's interesting to note that this is still low relative to Scotland's population share. So we had about 6% of net international migration to the UK in the year to June 2022, relative to about 8% of the population. A lot of this is concentrated in Scotland's cities and also among younger immigrants. And it's worth noting that immigrants play an important role in various parts of the labour market in Scotland, particularly in information and communications, in education, accommodation and food services, and health and social care.
When you compare the immigration levels that have been occurring over the years into the UK, you compare England alongside Scotland, it stands to reason that England seems to end up with a good portion of the annual amount that come in annually, whereas Scotland only sees a fraction. But that's not to suggest that Scotland isn't taking its fair share. I would just argue that it's at a relatively more slow, methodical pace, even. So much so that it sort of goes unnoticed for many in the country, as this latest social science study has showcased. Yeah, as they go on to indicate that a good portion of the people that participated in their latest survey regarding attitudes towards immigration, they barely come into contact with any immigrants. Now, that should be sort of pause for thought that the country at present overall is somewhat homogenous, as they also refer to it, And God forbid that we wish to preserve something like that. God forbid we remove ourselves from what should be considered the status quo. Nah, instead, we have to pursue the new normal, the future, where diversity will become the norm, ever increasingly so. But I just want to point out a few things here before I go back to what was played at the start there. Bear in mind that every single year, Scotland's population continues to reach new record highs, all because of immigration. As it says here, that our population grew to 5.4 million in 2022, the largest population ever recorded on a census. And then, of course, just recently, there was more news reports coming out that net migration's at a record high as well. All this in the backdrop of the S&P insisting that we have an immigration problem. ... We're not having enough immigrants coming in. This obviously increase in net migration. Net migration has more than doubled between 2021 to 2022. According to statistics published today, this was in July the 9th of this year. In the year of June to 2022, net migration into Scotland was 48,000 compared with 22,000 in the year before. This is the highest level of net migration over the last decade. This increase is a result of higher levels of international migration into Scotland, with 36,000 more people moving to Scotland from outside the UK than leaving in the year, compared with 13,000 from the year prior. This, however, comes on the backdrop of, it all adds up. Pessimism over Scotland's future linked to record low birth rate. Economic woes and a lower standard of living are contributing to the fall, with one expert saying more migrants is the only answer. He's not the only expert saying this, of course. The S&P themselves are saying this. In fact, the status quo, politically speaking, is immigration. That is the answer to all of our problems. Now, it stands to reason if you can't force people to have children, then your only other alternative surely would be to import people. But therein lies the issue that never seems to get addressed. Something I've pointed out on numerous occasions, to the point where I just feel like I'm banging my head off a metaphorical wall. Nobody is thinking long term. This conversation, the topic, the long-term ramifications are never brought into the discourse whenever this topic is raised. And when I say it's raised, it's very rarely raised for that matter. It's just said in passing as if this is self-explanatory. Migration is the only answer. Couples being less optimistic about the future in Scotland compared with those in England is contributing to a declining birth rate, a population expert has claimed. So bear in mind, our population is reaching year upon year record new highs, all due to immigration, while simultaneously our births continue to plummet. Saying here that the number of births in Scotland has fallen to its lowest level on record, according to official figures, which basically just means that it's even lower than it was last year, because every single year for the best part of a decade now, it's been as low can be. In fact, a few years ago, it was the lowest ever since records actually began in 1855. And ever since then, it's just continued to plummet down the way, breaking these records annually. Same principle applies with our population increase. Yeah. And there's always this talk about demographic time bomb. There has been a long-term decline in the number of births in Scotland since the 1970s, with more deaths than births being registered for 9 consecutive years now. Women are having fewer children, and those who are having them are becoming mothers in later life, a trend that continued last year, according to the latest figures. There were only 45,000 live births registered last year, which was the lowest annual total since records began in 1855, and a 2% decrease from 2022. You know, we've got this as well. Scotland's birth rate falls to the lowest recorded level. You know, infant mortality rose as well. However, the overall death rate for Scotland's population fell back to normal levels for the first time since the coup. However, that doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, we're still not having enough children. And that should be a serious concern. But of course, the answer is always immigration. Always standard. So what is the solution? Obviously, as I say there, it's immigration by and large. The SNP over the years have brought out a few different policies that they intend to implement, or projects, I should say, vanity projects even, such as their, this is their population task force, if from memory. I think I've gone over this before in video, but, you know, Scotland for the future, the opportunities and challenges of Scotland's changing population. And let's just go to encourage. When they go on to say here, we want to encourage, oh dear. We want to encourage families and people of working age to come to Scotland. So we're not going to do anything about getting younger people onto the property ladder. We're not going to even entertain the concept of trying to figure out or establish why these trends are very visible in Scotland, such as women pursuing careers. We know the answers to these things. It's rhetorical, and it's not really limited to just Scotland anyway. It's happening all across the Western world, and I would argue it kind of works perfectly in tandem with feminism, by and large. Nobody's suggesting that women shouldn't want to go out and get a job, especially in this day and age. But at the end of the day, society has become structured over the decades now to sort of prohibit women from being able to become stay-at-home mothers, even if they so wish to do so. It's just not financially feasible. It's more difficult, you know, and then that's not even taking into consideration the lack of desire to start a family, and that goes for men too. It's just not desirable for many now. And for the ones that do wish to pursue that lifestyle, it's difficult to find somebody who shares that sentiment. And on top of that, even if you do find your hypothetical soulmate, you then run into all the struggles, such as I said, the property ladder, etc. Everything is too fucking pricey. There's a multitude of things that they could, in effect, attempt, or at the very bare minimum, insult our intelligence and pretend that they're going to try out, such as encouraging native births, etc. But they won't do any of these things because it's much more simpler to just import people. You know, even going through this document, a number of countries across the world are considering the impact of a declining birth rate. Some countries have put in place incentives to encourage people to have children, while other countries have focused on addressing the potential barriers that may discourage people from having a child. For example, some countries that offer more generous parental leave packages, such as Sweden, which offers 480 days of gender-blind parental leave, and as a result, they've got a higher fertility rate than Scotland. That's not to say that the policy interventions are the reason behind the higher fertility rates, but does suggest more investigation into family-friendly policies and the impact on fertility. We must continue to promote Scotland as a favourite country, not just for our children, with our aim to reduce child poverty from 1 in 4 as it currently stands to 1 in 10 by 2030, but also by empowering women to return to the workplace after having children, if they wish to do so. We need to ensure that workplaces are fair and give women the same opportunities to pursue a worthwhile career. Similarly, we must continue to encourage broader participation of women in business and entrepreneurship. Of course, that's what we need. Fuck the idea of motherhood. No. We need to get more women to become entrepreneurs. Of course, that's what we need. Let's see what else they say. Our diet and healthy weight delivery plan. Oh, yeah. Saving the day. One day at a time, Let me see, though. There was a section at the side before I go any further. Family friendly, yeah? So, I think that might be in the section that was just on, admittedly. So it goes on about our declining birth rate, etc. Goes on about some of the reasoning for it and wider societal impact of COVID, housing, ambition. But there was a section there, migration, of course. So we'll go to that instead before I move on. Don't want this video to be far too long. But migration, of course, is their go-to. And let me see. Scotland's population, I love this. So, this bit here. Scotland's population is projected to grow by 2.5% between 2018 to 2043. All of this growth is projected to come from migration, as there are projected to be more deaths than births in Scotland every year moving forward. However, this projection is not a forecast. It assumes that migration flows will stay broadly consistent with average levels over recent decades. Oh, it's mental, isn't it? So we just need to continue to have our borders wide open in order for us to fulfill what a computer module, how do you believe, is the outcome for our future. Yeah, it makes sense, of course. And it goes on about the EU, leaving the EU, and then they've got a expert advisory group on migration and population, which was commissioned to ensure the impact on Scotland's economy, communities, and public services. This group estimated the impact of the plans would be a 50 to 80% reduction in net EU migration to Scotland after 2020 and an overall reduction in overseas net migration. These changes would disproportionately affect our rural areas. Now, of course, on top of that, what else did they come out with? They came out with their population strategy, which aims apparently to tackle some of the root causes for why people leave specific areas, in particular rural areas. So addressing housing, addressing work shortages and whatnot. All these things that they're quite prepared to allegedly put into place to encourage people to stay in local areas, but yet they can't put these same methods into place to try and incentivize people to have children. Makes you wonder. Truly makes you wonder. In all honesty. Now, these social scientists seem to be part of some project that I've only come across in recent days, where some of their findings eventually get put forth to the government and whatnot. I don't necessarily think that they're making very many recommendations for the government to sort of accept, but it's more a case of giving them sort of information that they've managed to compile, such as, obviously, societal attitudes towards immigration. But I just wanted to start off with this very briefly because, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. If you happen to be Scottish, whether you realise it or not, you are effectively a lab rat. There isn't a day that goes by where our government aren't doing some sort of fucking bullshit, unbeknownst to the vast majority of people, including yourself potentially. And this is really no different here. And I'll show you what I'm talking about in just a second. Just wanted to kind of go back on myself here a bit by pointing this slide out first, where they say here that unsurprisingly, those who would like to see immigration to Scotland reduced, either a little or a lot, were more likely to agree with negative statements and disagree with positive ones, while those that would like to see immigration increased are more likely to disagree with negative statements and agree with positive ones. They then say that these questions were intended in part to see in how far public attitudes corresponded or not to some of the most prominent messaging from the media and political elites, either Scottish or elsewhere, about the potential impacts of immigration. all except the question about demographic benefits, were taken from a special Euro barometer survey on integration of immigrants. Therefore, an earlier UK-wide dataset exists, but it's not possible to discern the extent to which responses from Scotland would have differed. On demographic benefits, it is particularly striking that our data shows appreciation that migration can bring new people to areas which need them. This contrasts with findings from the National Conversation public meeting in 2018. But this bit here, where they're sort of framing questions to try and showcase certain things, because when they make reference here to prominent messaging, okay, so the attitude that these people are adopting here is that people have specific opinions about immigration because of the way that the topic of immigration, the conversation of immigration, is portrayed and discussed, whether that be via the media or whether that be from the government or any of their lackeys themselves. Point in case, in fact, when we come to their page here, they even go on to say attitudes and narratives on immigration, emphasis on narratives here, okay? It is often observed that Scotland is an outlier in the UK in terms of politics of migration. While immigration is not a devolved competence, the main political parties have embraced the case for increasing migration to Scotland due to ongoing concerns about declining population and labour market shortages. Okay, again, nobody's talking about the long-term ramification. They then go on to say here that migration, let me see if I can zoom in slightly. This bit, yeah, right? Migration is not a salient and contentious issue in the Scottish media political debate in the way that it is at a UK level. Moreover, surveys have suggested that the Scottish public is generally more welcoming of migrants than their counterparts in the rest of the UK. These factors raise important questions about how different Scotland really is and what explains this divergence. Two recent studies shed light on how we might address these questions. And their first study is addressing the production and impact of migration narratives. Right, you click on this. This will take you to another page that I've got opened up here. But this suggests a significant part of attitudes towards migrants and political debate and immigration can be traced back to migration narratives. All right, the stories we tell about migration and its causes and effects. These narratives circulate in the media and public political debate, such as in parliaments and policy-making venues, and can be hugely influential in how immigration is framed. Oh, is that right? The role of the media and of political leaders in establishing and disseminating narratives in migration, and crucially what happens when populist narratives dominate the debate and how mainstream parties respond. Okay, so we come to this Bridges page, for example, addressing the production and impact of migration narratives, Bridges' key findings. So during 3 years, they studied the causes and consequences of migration narratives, looking not only at migration narratives as such, but also in particular at the process behind them. As for narrative production, it examined how narratives develop in media and social media. The goal was not only to identify the main dominant migration narratives, but more in general to explore which storytellers are key, what circumstances favour the emergence of certain narratives, and how these stories spread within and across media spheres. All right. See what I'm saying there? Like, a key question here was to explain the increasing dominance of popular lay narratives characterized by simplistic and emotive accounts. Making use of experimental methodologies and a form of social psychological perspective, it explored the transformative power of testimonial narratives about immigration and their capacity to influence how we think and feel about migration. The project also looked at the impact of EU-funded information campaigns on the decision-making process of potential migrants. Key question in this case was whether narratives in the public political debate and policy-making diverged from more divisive and populist narratives to more technocratic accounts, and what this means in terms of policy response. Kind of get where this is going, don't you? I would assume. So, you know, there's quite a lot to unpack with all of this. You can download their PDF. Which is one here. The concept of narratives, okay, has gained traction in migration research. However, we still know comparatively, comparatively a little about how narratives on migration influence political debate and policy making. We consider how the narratives that emerge in the media are taken up and influence political debate and policy making. Of particular interest is how often simplistic, emotive migration narratives circulating in the media and political debate are processed in policy making. Okay. So obviously their sort of conclusion to all of this is that they wish to sort of reframe how immigration is discussed and presented. You know, we need to focus more on the facts according to them, but also a bit more emotional, their journeys, etc. As opposed to the sort of a hostile environment, this so-called hostile environment. Yeah. And it goes on and on and on and on. It's quite a lot of pages in this document, and I'm obviously not going through it all. But I just wanted to sort of showcase that this is what they're doing simultaneously with their little attitudes to attitudes to immigration surveys and whatnot. But it goes on and on and on and on. And then we come to this. We'll go back to the PDF. This one here, I think it was. So come up slightly. I'm not going through all of this. I just wanted to showcase something pretty quickly here. So they say that migration has consistently been an important issue in UK politics over several decades. At UK level, debates around migration often focus on economic impacts and labour market needs, but also on culture, integration, security concerns, with different types of migration routes and impacts conflated. The view from Scotland has looked somewhat different. Long-standing cross-party consensus on the need for immigration brings together demographic, culture, and economic arguments, arguably driven by the elite political perspectives. See, again, there's them making reference to people's opinions are simply shaped, arguably, air quote unquote, driven by elite political perspectives. That's funny because they make reference to demographic arguments, but yet I'm yet to hear one demographic argument from any politician, elite or otherwise. It's never brought up. They simply point to record low birth rates and simply point to the solution being immigration. And again, nobody's thinking long term. Nobody's arguing whatsoever that certain parts of the country where people are feeling compelled to leave because there's a shortage of work or island communities and whatnot might very well be struggling given this day and age where people are having less children, etc. Nobody's disputing that. Nobody is disputing that you might require some people to move to these areas to sort of bolster the workforce. Nobody is disputing that. Who you import there is another matter entirely, but nobody is disputing that. But again, the point that's never raised here is demography in and of itself. The elephant in the room here, that regardless of whether you imported 10,000 Polish people, 50,000 Finnish people, 60,000 Danish people, or 80,000 Pakistanis, they're not Scottish. They're not even British or Britons even. We are declining. This is where the concern should be. This is where the emphasis should be. But yet this survey never mentions that whatsoever. No, it just asks you how you feel about migrants. It doesn't ask you to think deep and critically about the future. It doesn't ask you to consider the long-term ramifications of what it could mean. None of that. What does the Scottish public think about immigration? What does the Scottish public think about the possibility of us dying out as a people? And that's not even me being hyperbolic. That's the fucking statistical reality of what's going on here. This cannot continue as it is, but it is continuing. And they're doing nothing about it apart from intending to import people. And in the process, to make that process easier, they're going about ways to try and sort of soften you up and condition you into becoming more accepting, claiming that any negative attitude that you may very well have about immigration or the concept of the people, whatever it may be, probably driven by elite political perspectives that they intend to try and reshape. It's just fucking... So anyway, it goes on a bit more. says that the migration policy attitude survey is a first step in our work towards building a more robust evidence base of attitudinal data on migration in Scotland. In developing this evidence-based migration policy does not take the position that migration policy should be defined by public views on immigration. The factors that should be weighed up by policymakers in this area are much more complex than those that could be captured through public opinion polling. Nevertheless, better understanding of attitudes and how these change over time can play an important role in identifying opportunities for policy change. Okay. But I just want to show you this bit as well. Calm down a wee bit. I mean, it goes on a bit. And they start talking about like a greater proportion of the Scottish public want immigration to be increased rather than decreased. The impacts of immigration are seen as positive by the majority of people in Scotland. This is true of impacts of Scotland, both overall Scotland and local area level. People in Scotland have a strong preference for labour migrants to have the option to remain in Scotland for longer, to settle and integrate. Oh, isn't that funny? So it's presented here as if everybody's got a great attitude towards immigration in Scotland, apparently. But yet they then concede themselves that Scotland, where is it? Let me see. It should be down here. Let me see. Most people overestimating. Nope. Here we go. Surveys and attitudes to migration regularly investigate people's preferred levels of immigration, asking respondents whether they would like to see levels increase, reduced, or remain as they are. When interpreting these results, one should keep in mind that people's estimates of the current level of immigration exhibit wide margins of error, as shown above. The migration policy survey found that people in Scotland are less likely to wish for reductions in migration than to desire an increase. Oh, is that so? Okay. But bear in mind, as I'm coming to it here, right? It's down here somewhere. Impacts of immigration for Scotland and local areas. And it's coming, because I'm using StreamYard, it's not like I can just pause and then resume when I get to the fucking section. So you just have to bear with me a second there. But it should be here somewhere. Like, fucking hell. Jesus. But yeah, I mean, it's all very well and good asking people like, oh, how do you feel about like some immigrants? But like, again, we're not seeing it anywhere near the levels of England in certain areas. And that enough, they concede this themselves in this survey as well as their podcast, which I'll play. Here we go. Until recently, Scotland had experienced relatively low and stable levels of national and ethnic diversity within its population. Surely that would be something that you would wish to preserve. This should be the status quo. This should be normal. But even then, they go on to say that until recently, so it's starting to change. We never asked for that, but it's changing anyway. At present, roughly 10% of the Scottish population were born outside of the UK and 7% are citizens of other countries. This represents a fairly modest level of migration when compared to England, where 60% of the population is foreign-born and 10% are citizens of other countries. The migrant population in Scotland has seen a marked and steady increase since the early 2000s. In percentage terms, Scotland has seen the fastest increase within the UK nations, but yet it's happening at such a smaller rate in comparison that it goes back to what I said at the beginning of the video. It's somewhat methodical in nature. It is happening, and there's certain parts of Scotland that are becoming relatively unrecognizable. If you were showing a picture of that and then a picture of Birmingham, if you weren't from either of those two areas, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. But it's not a problem that's been seen all across Scotland as of yet. Only specific little cohorts of the country. In this context, migration policy attitude survey included questions about attitudes to diversity, seeking to understand both whether people view diversity as positive in general and whether they would prefer to live in more or less diverse areas. Survey respondents displayed strong positive attitudes in diversity. Nearly 3 in 4 believe that diversity is good for Scotland, while 3 in 5 believe that diversity makes an area more enjoyable to live in, and less than 1 in 5 would prefer to live in an area where people are from the same ethnic background. I would love for these numbers to be broken down a bit more, though. Surely, are the people that are claiming that they believe diversity makes an area more enjoyable to live in, are they part of the diverse cohort themselves? Or are they coming from a part of the country where they've got like an Indian restaurant and a Pakistani shop owner, right? And maybe a couple of brown or black neighbors in the vicinity, but for the most part, their town or their village or whatever it may be is still relatively all one color. I find it difficult to believe that most people would feel comfortable being in an area where they're like the absolute minority, especially knowing the fact that that wasn't the case 20 years prior. But here we go. Responses to these questions showed only limited variations between subgroups of respondents based on age, location, and levels of social contract. So, figures, attitudes towards diversity are strongly positive. Having a mix of different people in an area makes it a more enjoyable place to live. I believe that diversity is good for Scotland. Age, young people were more likely to agree that diversity is good for Scotland. Of course they were. Yeah, products of their school environment. A majority of both urban and rural residents stated that having a mix of different people in an area makes it a more enjoyable place to live. And then social contract. Those with the least social contact, with immigrants were the most likely to prefer to live in an area where people are all from the same ethnic background. However, even amongst those who have reported having no social contract with immigrants, 40% agreed that having a mix of different people in an area makes it a more enjoyable place to live. I don't even understand how you would come to that conclusion. As outlined above, attitudes to immigration in Scotland are formed in the context of lower levels of diversity. Fewer people in Scotland have direct personal relationships or interactions with immigrants or experience of living in an area where significant levels of immigration. To understand this better, the Migration Survey gathered data on levels of social contact with migrants. In each of the preceding sections, we've discussed our differing levels of social contact related to attitudes and preferences. The survey asked respondents to select from a number of statements those which best describe the degree of social contact with migrants. Nearly 1 in 2 respondents have no regular interaction with immigrants in their community, and only 1 in 5 have a friend or friends who are immigrants currently living in Scotland. Only 1 in 3 say that they regularly speak to people who are immigrants. All right. So again, it's not like the vast majority of people in the country are exposed to mass migration as of yet. Some might be starting to feel the ripple effects, and some, regrettably so, live in dire places in certain quarters of Glasgow. But for the most part, it's not really something that's a problem yet. And as a result, I would make the argument that's probably why your little survey is showing such a positive response to the concept of migration at present. Give it another 20 years, we'll see where we're at. You know? So, with that said,
also potentially a really interesting space in the policy landscape. So, we could continue to have the kind of divisive, ideologically driven policy discussion that we've been having, or there's an opportunity there to lean into this more pragmatic space and to feed it with good evidence and a well-managed system for immigration, and that might actually pull those opposing, kind of apparently opposing positions in the attitudinal data together.
Well, and it seems like something that would make a lot of sense to have, and that's certainly something that we argue for a lot here, is to have a more evidence-based approach to policy making in general. And it is really interesting, the pieces that you've pulled out about, what are people's overall attitudes, and then are those really the categories that are realistic for us to reduce? And the new Labour government has made a commitment to reduce overall net immigration, but they've not put a number on it, and they've not really said how they plan to do that. So hopefully there's an opportunity, as you've said, to feed into that process and to get a bit more evidence in there. Mm-hmm. Was there anything else that jumped out for you from the attitudes results?
So I think it is interesting that there does seem to be an appreciation of both the need for and potential contribution that migrants can make in Scotland. And 50% in our survey say that migration has a positive impact on Scotland as a whole, and only 26% see that impact as negative. And here we see this recognition of Scotland's needs. The positive statements that people agree with most strongly are around the potential for or the experience of immigration filling jobs where there are shortages, bringing people to places that need them, and enriching Scotland's cultural life. And that doesn't mean there's no concerns. We do find people concerned about what they see as either actual or potential negative impacts of migration. So this is around burdens on the welfare system and potential for social conflict. But I think what was a surprise both this year and last year, and it runs counter to what you usually see in attitudinal data, is that people are more positive about the impact of immigration on the nation as a whole than they are in their local area. So you tend to find in attitudinal survey data that people kind of will pick up on a broader narrative about migration as problematic, but then when you get down to the nitty-gritty and the details of their experience of living alongside migrants or the impacts that they see, often you find more positive attitudes, and that's often been explained through reference to things like contact theory and so on. In Scotland, we're finding the opposite, and I could hypothesize about why that is. We don't actually know. But what we are also finding is very low levels of reported contact. And that comes back to your point about, yes, immigration to Scotland has grown quite substantially in the last 20 years. But compared to large areas of England, not all of England, and other parts of the UK, Scotland still is very monocultural, not terribly diverse. So we found that 51% of people in our sample reported having no regular social contact at all with immigrants living in Scotland. And I find that, coming from London, I still find that quite astounding. So this could explain a clustering towards neutral views on impact at the local level. So what we found at the local level was we were asking people about rating the impact on a scale from 0 to 10. And it wasn't necessarily that people said at a local level that immigration was having a negative impact. They were more likely to cluster towards 5. And so we don't know, but that could be explained by people saying, well, there's not much migration to my local area, so I can't say that it's either positive or negative. It's just not impacting. That's a possibility. We don't know that that's the reason. But it also begs a question about what that might mean for attitudes as more areas of Scotland experience migration. And I think.
And why would they say that so matter-of-factly? You know what I mean? Let me mute that.
No, the Scottish Government doesn't.
Why would they? It's just it's the fact it's said so matter-of-factly now. You know? Well, these attitudes remain as they are as Scotland becomes more and more at one with migration. Because it's just said so matter-of-factly, this is the status quo, this is the reality, this is the new normal, this is the way of life. There isn't even a fucking debate anymore, or not that there ever was one, about whether or not we wanted to embark on this so-called journey to begin with. They're just now monitoring your attitudes as things begin to change. Things that you can't change. Changes that you can't change. So they just try to coerce your behavior or your mindset to become more favorable and accepting and tolerant. They try to stamp out any negative thoughts that you might have, going so far as to insinuate that those negative thoughts that you might have about the concept of immigration, that's mainly just down to, elite politicians' perspectives, etc. It's that pesky mainstream media. The same one that calls you racist all the time, but they're still at fault somehow. Yeah, of course. How can they reframe the narrative of migration? How can they make it so that people are more accommodating, more accepting? Let's stick to the facts, apparently. And let's make stories more emotional. Tell everybody about their journeys, etc. I mean, it even says that in their fucking PDF, or one of their PDFs even. I can see if I can quickly find it. Let me see. Journey. Here we go. Yeah. There we go. For this reason, we would like to speak to everybody who produces narratives about migration, and to those who consume, read, and distribute them. Among them, we can list NGOs, journalists, etc., and many more who use social media. To all of them, we dedicate this final section. Create real, human, relatable narratives. When creating immigration narratives, we can highlight the personal journey, the struggles, the triumphs, the highs, and the lows. We can create stories where the protagonist is human and relatable. What is more, we can even appeal to intense and complex emotions, whether highlighting injustice and resilience of accomplishment and achievement. Transformative testimonials are those that evoke real feelings. We believe that immigration testimonials should bring Divergent points bring people closer together and help us transcend political and or cultural differences. Let us engage with narratives as we would with a new acquaintance, with an open-minded perspective that enables us to recognize shared human experiences. Oh, fuck no. Yeah. We expect that the results of this work package will prove beneficial in a global landscape characterized by contrasting perspectives on immigration. In this context, immigration narratives could function as narrative vaccines, and as such could produce doses of empathy to immunize against prejudice and mitigate against differences. Yeah. You see what I'm saying? So this is the sort of route they're trying to take here. Oh, Jesus, man. I don't know, man. Love it. So, I mean, this whole thing's presented as if, like, oh, our attitudes are really great to immigrants, but, and then goes on to say, though, that itself that is it there? There. When considering potential differences in attitudes, it's important to acknowledge that Scotland has not experienced the same levels of immigration as other nations and regions in the UK, suggesting little engagement in contentious issues such as downward pressures on wages. Moreover, since immigration is not a devolved policy area, it has not been instrumentalised within the context of party competition. Similarly, the apparent pro-immigration consensus among Scottish political elites appears to provide little newsworthy content for Scottish news outlets. Again, no, this in and of itself somewhat worrying because, again, you're right. Well, it's right to suggest something like downward pressure on wages or even the argument's probably not something that comes up very often in your average Scottish town or city. But because it's not so much of an issue at present, aka noticeable diversity everywhere, even the conversations about long-term demography are worlds away from ever being discussed properly. When people are asked about, they're saying we need some immigrants. When you're living in an all-white town or a predominantly all-white town, you're not really going to fucking give a nut and care, are you? Anyway, there's one last thing in this thing here that I will play quickly. Share this.
In the local versus national area, maybe picking up on a more positive at the moment or in the past few years, political narrative about what immigrants do for Scotland, but that could also change. And so that's something that in future years I would be really interested to see. And I hope you're able to continue to do the survey because that may indicate something about what the narrative is at a Scotland-wide level as well.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, that's one of our kind of working hypotheses on why we might be seeing this difference in other studies where you've had the reverse with the national local picture. The suggested explanations have been around contact theory, but also around the broad negativity in media and political rhetoric across the UK about immigration. And certainly it's true that in Scotland we haven't seen that in the same way. And the if you like, elite political rhetoric has been very positive, and there has until very recently been quite a lot of cross-party consensus on that. So even the parties that one might expect to be more anti-migration or anti-immigration have either not said very much because it's not in Scotland's power, or have actually said, yes, we agree that Scotland has needs around its labour force and its demographic situation. So yeah, I think that is possible.
Yeah, and as you said, Scottish government controls a lot of policies that dictate the experience of immigrants in Scotland, even if it doesn't control the criteria by which they're allowed to arrive. I think it's also relevant to the Scottish government to be aware of some of the attitudes, but I think the survey also raises an interesting question about how responsive policies should be to these attitudes, given that we know that they change over time and they respond to political rhetoric and that kind of thing.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, we've been very clear in both of the reports we've written from our attitudinal data that at Migration Policy Scotland, we don't view public attitudes as something that should shape policy, but that understanding them can explain where there's room for maneuver, where there are opportunities, where there are areas that policymakers could choose to take up a space that's there. So exactly as I was saying before about this pragmatism, that may provide a space. It's not a guide to what policymakers should do, but it can give them insight into areas where they don't have to be boxed in to continuing a particular tack or a particular line around immigration